Welcome to the Data Friday. My name is Michael Olschimke. I'm the CEO of Scalefree. We run this session here every Friday to allow you, the audience, to essentially ask questions about data 2.0, data-driven solutions, cloud computing, anything data relevant, I would say. You can just use the chat here if you want to raise a live question. You can use the Q&A here in the client. You can just raise your hand to get voice. You can also use a form, which I will show you essentially after today's session, at least a link, where you can submit your question essentially if you want and upload some pictures. If you receive multiple questions, I would essentially cherry pick one of those questions out for this today's sessions. And these sessions might end up on YouTube, and they will, the good ones at least. And yeah, therefore it's a bit time boxed. So we typically have 10-15 minutes for answering your questions. And if there will be no question at all, I will talk about the cluster. But we typically have at the moment enough questions, but shoot more if you need, raise your questions, right? It's all good. So let me just check. We have one question here. This is about essentially project tracking or project management in Data 2.0. And as you know from the training, there's a Data 2.0 methodology, and it's based to some extent, to a good extent, on Scrum. So it's an agile methodology, but it's not using 100% Scrum. It is not 100% Scrum. It's using 80% of Scrum and 20% from other concepts. So the team here is essentially struggling with the application of Scrum in Data 2.0 because they use a Kanban board, and the Kanban board is filled with technical user stories. For example, you would have something like create staging table, create raw data vault, or create the metadata, create a dimension, and so on. But in theory, a user story should be really focused on the business, on the business needs, and not on technical tasks, right? So how do we deal with this essentially? Now, first of all, in a Scrum methodology, we have these sprint plans, because what we want to achieve is that we end up in this factory, in this data factory, where we produce, well, information factory, where we produce information on a constant basis. Every sprint, every 4 weeks, every 3 weeks, you produce some new information artifacts, some new reports, some new dashboards, some KPIs. That's the goal. Every sprint should be more or less producing this on a regular basis, right? Just like on the belt. And for that, essentially, when a requirement comes in, information requirement comes in, we have a sprint plan. So we essentially structure how the sprint looks like. What kind of activities do we need to do to get the information requirement implemented? That's the idea. And the sprint plan details out all the activities to be done during the sprint. So let's say review the information requirements, identify the sources, maybe if you haven't done it yet, stage the data if you have a relation staging area, right? So and then set up the metadata for the raw data vault, deploy the raw data vault, and so on. The set of activities you want to have depends really on your tool stack, on how you work. That's number one. So it's not that there's a standard project plan or sprint plan. It really depends on you essentially. There are some templates out there, like in the book we have one sprint plan for some certain activities essentially. There might be also different types of sprint plans depending on the type of sprint. So some teams, they essentially develop new functionalities, new business value. Some teams, they're all about ingesting a new source system into the data lake and so on. So there might be different, and there will be different sprint plans depending on the project. So that's number one. With that in mind, the sprint itself should be focused on some certain functionality. So I wouldn't expect many user stories. I would expect that each team is maybe focusing on 1 or 2 larger information requirements, what needs to be produced essentially during the sprint, not having so many small tasks essentially to be done. Well, because you have multiple teams, because there might be different people in the team that might focus on other tasks, there might be a few user stories. But if you really focus on business value, there shouldn't be too many of them. Well, a user story has subtasks, and they arrive essentially from the sprint plan. So in order to get the business value delivered, you need to stage some data, you need to set up the metadata for the raw data vault and so on, right? Or build the dashboard and so on. So these technical activities, they are subtasks to the information requirement that you're trying to set up essentially. And therefore there should be subtasks to the user story. And there's some tools where you can set this up actually. So for example, we have in the book, we have a sprint plan, essentially that's coming from more or less straight from the book, where we have a essentially a typical sprint plan with different activities, what needs to be done in which order, essentially, how long will it take, and so on. So that's a typical sprint plan for developing some business value, some report or dashboard without automation. So it's really all done manually, essentially. And in a tool like, for example, Azure DevOps, but also we have an internal project management tool also based on Kanban boards in our sales installation, where we also organize our tasks with subtasks and so on. Essentially here you have only a few of those user stories. Right? It's not many, but every user story has a number of subtasks, and those are the technical tasks. Those are the current technical tasks that you have as user stories on your current Kanban board. We move them into the user story itself. So the user stories really focus on developing a finance dashboard, or what's this here? 1 second. Creating a sales pipeline dashboard, and so on. So that's the business value. That's based on the information requirement that you're trying to set up. And apparently, they're either couple of different people here. Well, I created the example for an article, to be honest, right? So it's all assigned to me. But typically you would have different people in the team. You might work on a few, very few, like 1, 2, max 1, 2, maybe 3 user stories in one team. But then you might have different teams working in parallel. So you might have a bit more of these user stories. But it's not that you're looking at 50 cards or something, right? Or 20 cards. You're looking at a few, less than 10 most probably, cards. And every card, every user story is really focused on some certain information requirement, and that's being set up. And while you progress in your sprint, while you work on your sprint plan, while you execute a sprint plan, you essentially execute or check off these technical tasks, essentially these technical subtasks. So that's where they belong, and you can set up these templates. I think the best tool I saw was really Jira. Because in Jira, you can set up templates for your user stories. And the template really means that whenever you create a new user story, the user story comes with those tasks, period. So you just drag them over. And that's how we essentially, in Jira settings, where we set up the subtasks, the sprint plan as subtasks in Jira, essentially. And over time, when you improve your sprint plan, because you're adjusting it during the retrospectives, you identify the issues that you have in your sprint, what's missing, what needs to be done, what needs to be stopped, and so on. And those questions affect the sprint plan. That's how you optimize your sprint execution, right? Which means that when you optimize the sprint plan, you adjust the template in Jira, and then for the next sprints, when users create new user stories, they will essentially use the new sprint plan. Essentially, that's the idea. So that's how we improve the sprint execution over time. That works in Azure DevOps as well. The only problem is you have to set up these tasks manually. There is a plugin for these templates to some extent, but it's not near to the Jira capabilities there. So but you can set up these subtasks. It's just manual work, and you have to recreate that manually. Essentially, that's the only drawback. But it's the task of the Scrum manager then. All right, so that's how we organize it. So we have really only a small number of user stories, lots of technical tasks inside the user story, and that's how we're moving forward. Essentially, that's the idea. All right. There's one more question. Yeah, let me. There's one question here on the Q&A. Let me just answer this live here. Is there any material, paper, book about implementation details of the operational vault? We found the concept very interesting, but we can't find much details in the data vault book or in the internet. So for the operational vault, that concept doesn't exist. Well, not exist physically, because the operational vault is really those tables in your raw data vault or in your information marts or in the business vault. So in the data vault model or in the information marts, which are used by external applications. But there could be any, right? So you could just use let's say a Java application or C# application that connects to your enterprise data warehouse and queries some information from it. Why? Because from my opinion, information is not just delivered in reports and dashboards. In a data-driven organization, you really want to have the information at the decision maker, no matter what. Could be via reports, could be via dashboards, could be by any means. And if you're integrating the information from the enterprise data warehouse into operational systems, in some dialogue showing the lifetime value of customers according to the enterprise data warehouse on the customer page, right? So we have done this with clients, integrating that into operational systems. We have done it into wiki systems, for example. Yeah, so that's let's see, two cases where it comes to my mind immediately. And then sure, reports and dashboards, and or business process automation, it comes. And so different cases, wherever information is acquired to make an informed decision, that's where we deliver the data and the information. So which means that the operation system might connect to your data warehouse and connect and query some data. Problem is, those tables, those entities where external applications query data from, you can't just refactor, you can't just modify. Well, you can refactor them, but you have to follow some certain activities, how you do it essentially. And which means that what we do is, first of all, you might want to think about how to structure this, maybe have an information mart, we call them interface marts, an information mart where a application can connect to for reading. So they typically query data out from an information mart, we call it interface mart then. That's where they get the data from. And when they want to write back some data, we use a real-time approach. They should just send a real-time message to the enterprise data warehouse, and we capture this data into a non-historized link typically. That way we decouple the application a bit from the enterprise data warehouse structures. But those structures where they communicate with the interface mart and the real-time feed somehow, those entities are considered as the operational vault because operational systems are directly accessing it. And those tables, you can't just modify the way you want. You have to talk to the operational system owners, because if you modify your entities without doing anything like refactoring and backwards compatibility and so on, you will break the applications. Or there's a risk for that, a high risk. So that's why we typically mark those entities in the metadata. That's where the operational vault exists actually. In the metadata, we mark those entities as part of the operational vault. So we are aware of the issue that we can't just modify them. That's what we consider as an operational vault. It's a logical concept, but not a physical schema or something. That's the idea. Cool. All right, good question. And if you have a question like this, 1 second, there you go. Yeah, use this form here, sfr.ee/dbfriday. Happy to take your live questions as well, right? So it's all good. And yeah, here you can essentially submit your question, upload some pictures if you want of your, maybe of a conceptual diagram of your whiteboard. It's all good. Also check out, sorry for that. Also check out our other webinars on essentially Warescape and DBT. So head over to scalefree.to/webinars. That's where you find the Zoom invites essentially, or the Zoom signups for the for those webinars. And also check out the upcoming conference in October, the Data Dreamland 2023, October 10 to 11 in Hanover, Germany. That's where we essentially come back all together, meet and greet, shake hands for real, and listen to some interesting customer talks and client talks and vendor talks. So it's a really interesting session typically. All right, cool. So yeah, thanks for joining today. And thanks for joining today, and I'll see you hopefully next Friday. Enjoy your weekend. See you next Friday. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining today. If you'd like to discuss this further, give us a call on the number below here, and we're happy to discuss this with you. See you next time. Have a nice weekend. Bye-bye.